What if I told you that there was a way you could study less for English ATAR, all of your other subjects, and actually get better marks in all of those subjects? If you internalize just one of the frameworks that you're going to learn in this lesson, that's what you'll be able to do.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Lesson objectives. What are we going to do in this lesson? Firstly, we'll understand the first way to think about learning, something that we can just refer to as the warehouse. Then we'll describe how things get into the brain. After that, we'll describe how things are kept in the brain. Then we'll explain the relevance of the warehouse to English ATAR Made Simple, this course, with reference to an example. After that, we'll understand the second way to think about learning. And that one is referred to as Bloom's Taxonomy. That's not something that I've created. It's this legit thing that a professor created. And with reference to that, we'll explain what Bloom's Taxonomy is. Then we'll list some verbs that are used in the context of different thinking skills. Then explain the relevance of Bloom's Taxonomy to English ATAR Made Simple, again, with reference to an example. And we'll also relate Bloom's Taxonomy to the warehouse, the first way to think about learning. Lastly, we will understand the third way to think about learning, which we can just refer to as making errors. Then we'll define what neuroplasticity is. After that, we'll discern the connection or figure out the connection between making errors and neuroplasticity. Then we'll explain the relevance of making errors to English ATAR Made Simple with reference to an example, and we'll relate making errors to the second way to think about learning, Bloom's Taxonomy, and to the warehouse. If I can simplify what I've just outlined in these objectives, we're going to look at three main ways that you can think about learning. And as I go through each of these ways, I just want you to bear in mind that at the end of this lesson, I just want you to be able to take away one way to think about learning, just one. So at the end of it, if you were vibing with the first way to think about learning and you didn't really connect with the other two, that's fine. Just make sure that you can remember the main gist of the first way. Similarly, if you really liked the second way to think about learning, sweet, just ignore the other two. There are a few different options in here because sometimes you will connect with an example more than, say, I might. The first way to think about learning, we'll call it the warehouse. What is this all about? I want you to imagine that your brain is like an Amazon warehouse. And in that warehouse, there are shelves. And on those shelves, there are a bunch of boxes of different shapes and sizes. And within those boxes, there are various parcels. And I want you to think that those parcels are like bits of information. That's our introduction to the warehouse. Now let's talk about how we can get things into the brain or into the warehouse. For parcels to enter the warehouse, they have to come through this small doorway. And you can only fit so many parcels through the doorway at a given time. The takeaway is it's best to learn in small little bite-sized chunks. That's what I've tried to do in English ATAR Made Simple. And I guess a good example of that is when you get to module 4, that's based on the responding section. And you'll see that there's one lesson for introductions, one lesson for body paragraphs, and one lesson for conclusions. The kind of point of that is your brain finds it easier to digest the information about introductions in one separate lesson, then body paragraphs in another separate lesson, and then conclusions in another separate lesson. Now, once the parcels enter the small doorway of the warehouse, then it's time for them to go to the short-term storage area of the warehouse. And we'll just refer to that as the STSA. Still a bit of a mouthful, but better than the full thing. After that, if they're in the STSA, it means that we can only retrieve the parcels for a short time before they go missing, hence short term. If we can apply this to our brains, the short-term storage area of the warehouse is called our short-term memory. Now, that's how we can get things into the brain. The next question is, how do we keep them in the brain? And if you want parcels to stay in the warehouse, they must be analyzed, sorted, and labeled before being placed in a box and stored on a shelf. Remember, the warehouse has a bunch of shelves, and within those shelves, there are boxes. And those boxes in the warehouse are called schemas. As we can see here on the slide, we've got one box, one schema, and then we've got parcels going into the box. If a parcel isn't analyzed, sorted, and labeled, it will be lost. And we can see that depicted on the slide here. We've got a parcel that's fallen away from the box, and it means that information, because remember, a parcel is a piece of information. We've lost that parcel because it doesn't promote our survival or well-being. It doesn't promote the survival or well-being of the warehouse. I'll discuss more on that in a second. We've already discussed the short-term storage area of the brain. That's where the parcels go once they enter the warehouse. And that's our short-term memory. But now we're on to keeping things in the warehouse, keeping things in our brains. So how do we do that? If we're looking at the warehouse, all the shelves that you see on this slide, all the shelves of the warehouse, collectively called the long-term storage area, or the LTSA. Now, if a box is in the long-term storage area, it means that we can retrieve it for later use. In other words, if a box is in the long-term storage area, information is in our long-term memory. The question that arises from this is, how do we get information that we learn into the long-term storage area of our brain, into our long-term memory? Just a moment ago, I mentioned these phrases of promoting survival and promoting well-being. And that's the answer to this question of how we get information into our long-term memory. If the warehouse thinks that a given parcel will promote its well-being or its survival, it will do the things necessary to get that information to a shelf in the long-term storage area. If our brains think that a piece of information that we're learning in class, wherever, is important for our well-being or our survival, then it will submit it to its long-term memory. Let's think about an example of this. I love movies, and for as long as I can remember, I've always had this weird ability to be able to recall the names of people who were in the movie, the cast, the names of the directors, the producers, the screenwriters, the people who wrote the score for the film, all of that stuff. I just love knowing about the people involved in creating a movie. And because I've got this natural fascination and interest in movies, my brain thinks that knowing those facts, for whatever reason, I don't know why, promotes its well-being. Knowing those facts makes me happier. And that's an example of how I can keep those facts in my brain, even though I'm not really trying to. And I guess our goal here is to convince our brains that the content that we're learning in English ATAR will promote our well-being or survival. How do we do that? A good reason to think that this stuff is promoting your survival is getting straight into uni. If you want to go straight to uni, means you have to pass English ATAR. Otherwise, you have to do the stat. If you can remember that learning this content will enable you to not do the stat over the summer holidays while everyone's having a great time, that's probably a good enough reason to trick your brain to think that it needs to soak up this information, to put it in the long-term storage area. The opposite of what we've just learned is that if the brain doesn't think that a piece of information will promote its well-being or survival, it just won't enter the long-term storage area. It won't enter the long-term memory. How is this relevant to English ATAR made simple? On the slide, we've got pieces of information that are discussed in this lesson. We're going a bit meta here. We're talking about how to learn in this lesson, and here you're learning about how to learn the information about how to learn. This lesson has multiple pieces of information and parcels, right? And as we know, the warehouse, that is your brain, it has a small doorway, and it can only fit a handful of the parcels through the small doorway. What that means is that if you want to take the information in this lesson and submit it to memory, you need to convince yourself that the information will promote your well-being or it will promote your survival. If you do this, the parcels will be stored in a schema, a box. After that, those boxes will be stored on a shelf labeled English ATAR Made Simple. You have two goals that are relevant to the warehouse and doing this course. Your first one is to have each box full of parcels, and each box represents a lesson in this course. And within each box, you've got parcels or little pieces of information. Your second goal is to have a box for every single lesson of this course on the English ATAR Made Simple shelf. Meaning, your goal is to have a box for each lesson and parcels within it in your long-term memory. If you can do that, you can apply the information you're learning in assessments. And ultimately, that's the goal of studying, right? That is the first way that we can think about learning, the first framework. Here's another way. As I mentioned at the start of the lesson, it's called Bloom's Taxonomy. What is Bloom's Taxonomy? This is something that most, if not all of your teachers probably learned about at uni. We're going to go through what Bloom's Taxonomy actually means, but a nice introduction to this, a nice way to think about it, is an example. And this example represents what Bloom's Taxonomy is trying to get you to do. On one hand, when you're studying for English ATAR, you could write notes about a text for a couple of hours. On the other hand, you could write a body paragraph under time conditions in 15 minutes. Bloom's Taxonomy will be telling you that that second option, writing a body paragraph under time conditions in 15 minutes, will be far more effective for you to learn than if you were to write pages of notes for 2 hours. So I'd like you to bear that in mind as we go through this, and I think you'll start to see how Bloom's Taxonomy supports that example. Okay, this is Bloom's Taxonomy. And what's it all about? A dude called Benjamin Bloom came up with a taxonomy in 1956, and this was revised in 2001, as you can see on the slide. There are 6 different levels or skills, and they get harder in complexity as you move up the pyramid. But at the bottom here, remembering is the easiest. Then understanding, that takes it to a next level. Then we go up to applying, actually using information in some sort of way. Then we're analyzing, then we're evaluating, and then we're creating. I know these levels will seem pretty abstract. We'll look through some examples. By the way, this word taxonomy, just think of it as a way of categorizing something. So that is what Bloom's taxonomy is, but what about a definition? I'm a big fan of definitions. For me, they're the kind of entry point into learning about a new concept. Here's a definition we can think of or use. Bloom's taxonomy is just a classification or various categories of different levels or skills. Now, as we saw, there are 6 levels in Bloom's taxonomy, and you might have noticed on the left-hand side of the pyramid over here that there are 2 different categories for those 6 different levels. And those 2 categories are, on one hand, lower order thinking skills or LOTs, and higher order thinking skills or HOTs. What are the lower order thinking skills? They're the 3 bottom levels of the pyramid: remembering, understanding, applying. How about HOTs? What are the higher order thinking skills? We've got analyzing, evaluating, and creating. One way that we can start to get a better understanding of each of the different levels of the pyramid is to look at some verbs that are associated with each level, some doing words. There should be a copy of this in the study notes, so don't worry, you don't need to write any of this down. I've created those notes for that purpose, so you can just focus on listening to what I have to say rather than writing and listening at the same time, which never works. And as we can see here, we've got verbs associated with each level of the pyramid. For instance, remembering, we've got define, describe, examine, identify. Then on the other end, moving to the end of the higher order thinking skills, we've got words like adapt, construct, create, negotiate. They're more technical, they're more complex. The point of this table is to illustrate that different verbs, different doing words have different levels of complexity. For instance, defining something, a remembering skill on the lower order thinking side, is much easier than adapting something, which is on the higher order thinking side. How is all of that stuff relevant to English ATAR made simple? In short, if you want to give yourself the best chance of learning the content in this course and really in any subject that you do, in anything in life, you want to start at the bottom level of the pyramid, remembering, and work your way up till we get to the top level, which is creating. Now, I told you earlier that we'd go through an example, and we're going to use this concept of voice in English ATAR as an example. There's a dedicated lesson to voice in Module 2, which I'm sure you'll be stoked about, but we'll just use that as a brief example for Bloom's taxonomy now. Our first level of the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy is remembering, and it requires us to recall specific facts. Applying this to voice, that might involve us being able to literally define the concept of voice. It might also involve us being able to list the concepts that influence voice. Also, it might involve us reciting the 3 overarching types of voice. And as you can see, I've emboldened and italicized those verbs, those doing words that are associated with this level of remembering. Moving on to the next level, we have understanding. It's getting a little bit higher or harder in complexity. And understanding, we can see, it requires us to actually grasp a meaning of the content. And in this case, it requires us to grasp an understanding of this concept of voice. So understanding voice might involve being able to describe what the concept of voice means. Then we've got explain. So if you have an understanding of voice, you might be able to explain the concepts that influence the construction of voice. It's different to just being able to tell me what those concepts are. Also, lastly, if you understand voice, you might be able to distinguish the different types of voice. As opposed to remembering, distinguishing the different types of voice actually involves highlighting the similarities and differences between those types. Next level, applying, involves using the information in a new but similar situation. Now, if you're applying the concept of voice, that might involve you being able to interpret how voice is represented in a studied text. Perhaps you're starting to see how this relates to an assessment environment. If you can apply the concept of voice, you might be able to examine the particular concepts that construct voice in a studied text. And if you can apply voice, that might mean you can relate the type of voice used in one text with a different type of voice used in another text. A classic example of this is when you've got a comparison question in the responding section where you're required to compare 2 texts. A fourth level. As we know from earlier, the bottom 3 levels were lower order thinking skills. Now we're in the top 3 levels and they're HOTS or higher order thinking skills. Our first level of HOTS is analyzing. Involves taking apart the known and identify relationships. It's pretty abstract. What does that mean? If we're analyzing voice, that might mean you could compare your own interpretation of voice with another person's interpretation of voice. Might involve you being able to criticize your examination of the particular concepts that construct voice. And it might involve you being able to analyze the way that you related one type of voice to a different type of voice. Second last level of HOTS and the taxonomy is evaluating. As we can see, it says that evaluating means to examine information and make judgments. Applying this to the concept of voice, you could be able to evaluate your interpretation of voice in a study text. You could grade your examination of particular concepts that construct voice, and you could summarize your analysis of the relationship between one type of voice and another. Last level, creating. Top of the pyramid, the highest skill in the taxonomy. What could this involve you doing with voice? A classic example is compose a text that features a central voice. When I mention this, hopefully you're thinking the composing section of the exam. You might be able to develop a system for examining the concepts that construct voice. Really, that's what I did when I created the lesson on voice. You'll see that I've got a pretty quirky way of thinking about voice. And in order for me to create that, I had to have those previous levels of understanding. That process of creating that lesson on voice enhanced my understanding of it. It took it to the next level because in order to create a system for examining the concepts that construct voice, I need to have a preliminary baseline understanding of it. Next, if you're creating something about voice, you might create a text that analyzes how 2 texts use different types of voice. Let's say I write an essay about how 2 texts use 2 different types of voice, and then you come along and create a text that analyzes my text. You can see how this is the most complex level of the pyramid. I want to highlight just a couple more points about how this is relevant to English ATAR Made Simple before we move on to another section. When we study, we often call it a day after the first level, remembering. Return to that opening example I mentioned about writing notes about a studied text. You just list out a few points about the themes in the text, and you're like, yep, I have done some good work today. I understand this text now. Let's move on. Hopefully, what you can see after learning about Bloom's taxonomy is that if you want to truly learn something, you need to do more than just remember some facts. You need to try and get as high up in that pyramid as possible. Again, ideally to the creating level. That's the first point that I wanted to highlight before we move on. The next one is the creating level in English ATAR made simple specifically requires you to engage in practice writing. I hope you didn't just vomit in your mouth. Practice writing sucks. We try to avoid it because we think that there is a more effective way of studying and we convince ourselves that's the case. But in the very last lesson of this course, here's a bit of a spoiler alert, I will be giving you 3 things that you can take away from the entire course. Just the 3 things that I want you to remember. And one of those 3 things is that you need to do practice writing. Now, how can we relate Bloom's taxonomy, the second way of learning that we've just discussed, to the warehouse, the first way of learning? We use lots, lower order thinking skills, to get parcels through the small doorway of the warehouse and into the short-term storage area. In other words, the information that you learn in lots will only be stored in the brain's short-term memory. Then you use HOTS, the higher order thinking skills, which involves analyzing, evaluating, creating, to sort the parcels into a box and then store that box onto a shelf in the long-term storage area. The information will then be indefinitely stored in the brain's long-term memory. Those are 2 ways that you can think about learning, and we've just got one more to go. And this one is making errors. And the takeaway from this third way of thinking about learning is that when we make an error doing a particular thing, and in this context, it would be making an error or doing something incorrectly in English, our brain is primed to fix that error by learning the right way or the correct way. Neuroplasticity. Lennox, why are we learning about this science term? This is an English ATAR course. Fair point, bear with me. Neuroplasticity is a prerequisite to understanding this point about making errors. What is it exactly? It's the brain's ability to adapt and change as a result of experience. This kind of relates to this whole idea of a growth mindset, which, as you learnt in the previous lesson, refers to this belief that your brain and your talents, your skills, can be improved upon. They can be worked at. They're not fixed like they are in a fixed mindset. And neuroplasticity is at the fundamental scientific level, it's what enables those adaptations to take place. How is this relevant to learning? Our brain adapts and changes when we learn new pieces of information. If you want a nice and simple way to think about neuroplasticity, you can think about it as learning and remembering things. Now, your science teacher might not like me equating the 2, but fundamentally they're quite similar. And if we're equating neuroplasticity to learning and remembering, obviously learning and remembering is our goal in this course, in school, in life. So what I'm getting at here is that we want to try and maximize neuroplasticity. We want to try and maximize the adaptations and changes going on in our brain. How is making errors relevant in the context of neuroplasticity? Well, when we make an error, biological mechanisms in our body tell our nervous system, the thing on the screen, and that's the body's command center, that something's wrong. After that, the command center deploys these neurochemicals that tell the neural circuits in the brain, the networks in the brain that you can see here on the screen, that they have to change. Put differently, your brain adapts and it changes as a result of an error. It learns. However, and unfortunately, it's not as simple as just making an error and calling it a day. The question that arises is, how do we go from making errors to neuroplasticity or remembering and learning stuff? The making errors part, that's step number 1, and neuroplasticity, that's our end goal. What has to happen in the middle? It involves drilling deeper into the activity that you're performing. This might sound a bit annoying because most of us get pretty frustrated and annoyed when we make errors. One example is you're a tennis player, you're trying to nail your topspin serve, and it either just keeps going into the net, it keeps going out, or it just keeps hitting the frame of your racket, and you're getting so frustrated. You're just getting in your head. The key here to eventually get to that point of neuroplasticity, to remember and learn how to nail the topspin serve, is to just keep drilling deeper into the practice. If you make an error and then continue performing the learning activity, regardless of what it is, tennis, English, ATAR, whatever, until you get it right, even just a little bit, that will then prompt the body's command center, the nervous system, to release molecules like dopamine. And the easiest way to think about dopamine is it's a feel-good molecule. It means that we want more of it. In turn, that will help your brain to adapt, change, and learn. Because remember, our brain, it's wired for survival. It wants to keep us alive. And if we drill deeper into the activity and then eventually get it right, we get that release of dopamine, and our brain's like, oh, I want more of that. Gimme. So it remembers what you did to have that dopamine release. It fixes it. It's like it creates this concrete image of what you did right in your brain. So what I'm saying is, if you want to maximize neuroplasticity, if you want to maximize learning and remembering stuff, you need to push through that frustrating and annoying feeling of making errors and then keep performing the activity until you start getting it right. Let's bring it back to English ATAR made simple and how you can apply this concept of making errors. Say you're completing the workbook activities related to the lesson on voice, similar to our example in the previous section. And you're writing about the narrative voice in a text you're studying. Then you realize that you should have been writing about directorial voice. You made an error. Don't worry if these terms of narrative voice and directorial voice don't make sense. Don't expect you to have any understanding of them right now. That'll be coming later, but just bear with me with the gist of the example. You made an error. You realize you spoke about the wrong type of voice. Then you get really frustrated because you hate the concept of voice. You don't understand the difference between the two types of voice. After that, your body's biological mechanisms tell the nervous system something's wrong, something's not right here. Then you remember that in order to access neuroplasticity, in order to effectively learn the content, you need to persevere through this frustrating feeling of just hating voice and wanting to throw your workbook in a fire pit. From there, after realizing that you need to persevere, you eventually have a light bulb moment where you realize, or where you understand, the difference between the two types of voice. That triggers the body's command center, the nervous system, to release dopamine, the feel-good molecule. You'll feel good once you have that light bulb moment. From there, because the brain is a little dopamine addict and it wants more of that feel-good molecule, it remembers how that dopamine molecule was produced. It remembers the getting right part of the exercise after you made all of those errors, which means that you've accessed neuroplasticity, or in other words, you've properly learned the difference between both types of voice. Final thing I wanted to say about how making errors is relevant to English ATAR made simple is, as you continue going through the course, you'll find a bunch of question breakdowns that I've created, and they're intended for you to use to review the practice writing that you create. And I'd like you to bear in mind the importance of making errors when you see those marking keys or those question breakdowns. I know that you'll be tempted to look at those question breakdowns before you answer a given question, but just remember why you're here. You're doing this course because you're trying to get better at English ATAR. So if you look at those question breakdowns before you actually answer the question, you're just sabotaging your own learning and you're wasting your own time. So remember, leveraging the frustration and the annoyance that you feel, it's a really hard thing to do because no one likes to feel frustrated and annoyed. But if you're able to persevere through it, you will do exceedingly well in this course and really any pursuit that you commit to in life. Relating making errors to Bloom's taxonomy and the warehouse. What we're doing here is trying to fit the three different puzzle pieces that we've learned about in this lesson and see how it all fits together. As we established earlier, you can use LOTS, the lower order thinking skills of Bloom's taxonomy, to get parcels through the small doorway of the warehouse and into the short-term storage area. From there, you can use HOTS, higher order thinking skills, to sort the parcel into a box and then store that on a shelf in the long-term storage area, the long-term memory of the brain. So that's how the warehouse and Bloom's taxonomy relates, but how does this idea of making errors relate to that stuff? Quite simply, neuroplasticity occurs when we store a new box on a shelf in the warehouse. In other words, neuroplasticity occurs when we get information into our long-term memory. Because when the body releases the dopamine, the brain's, oh, give me more, and it remembers what it did to get that dopamine. In order to do that, it remembers stuff, it gets it into the long-term storage area. That's how making errors relates to what we've just discussed. We've gone through a lot, just a couple of final notes. Now, remember how we mentioned earlier that if we want stuff to get into the warehouse and into the long-term storage area, the information, the parcels, it needs to promote our well-being and survival. Another way of thinking about that is that if the learning activity that you're engaged in, whether it be a physical sport or this course, whatever, if it's really important to you, or again, you make yourself believe that it's really important to you, you will access more neuroplasticity. You will be able to remember and learn more. Your brain might be pretty overwhelmed by all this stuff about learning how to learn. But as I said at the beginning of the lesson, I just want you to take away one framework from what we've discussed. If they all made sense to you and how they related made sense to you, great. But at the very least, just remember one of the 3 frameworks we learned, whether it be the warehouse, Bloom's taxonomy, or making errors, and bear that in mind as you continue going through this course. And that is it for the lesson. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, keep it simple.